Hey everybody, welcome back. So if you're new to my channel, my hobby life is RC aircraft and ultralights. And I jump back and forth. So if you're here for an ultralight, I've got an update coming soon, actually in the next 24 hours. And if you're here for RC, then sit back and enjoy. So this video is being made because of a question that was asked from my Facebook page. Now, I try to balance between my YouTube and my Facebook because my Facebook is 100% dedicated to my aviation life. And it's almost maxed out with all the people that's friended me. But I get questions from my Facebook and my YouTube, and sometimes even from my LinkedIn, because once in a while I'll post my aviation stuff on LinkedIn. But this video is made about that first flight. And I'm not going to dive into what you should do as far as the flight regiment for your test flight or your first flight. Okay, I'm going to talk about doing it safely and some of the emotions involved. Because if you spend an awful lot of time building an airplane, you can get really attached to it. And you can be very emotional. And then when you go to fly it, you have already gotten your anxieties really fired up. Okay? So let me click this and we'll get started. So the way we're going to do this video is we're going to talk about the do's and the don'ts, okay? And some of the stuff in the do's becomes pretty common sense and sometimes redundant if you have a checklist, okay? And then you're going to do your radio check, your CG, but the radio check and CG should be part of your checklist. The airframe, which could be making sure that your retracts have air pressure and your batteries are ready to go. That should be in your checklist. A warm-up flight, a lot of people don't do this, and it's something I learned to do a long time ago, is where I'll take just a regular airplane, one of my favorite airplanes, and I'll fly it a bunch. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. You got to make sure that the weather's decent. You don't want to be test flying in a 20-knot crosswind. And then you got to ask yourself, do I have the skills to test fly this airplane, or should I let somebody else test fly it? And the don'ts we'll get to in a minute. Before we get too deep into this, I want to talk about my sponsor, RTL Fasteners. If you go to their website and use code DA30, you'll get 30% off any order over $50. So if you need the servo screws, the blind nuts, the Allen heads, the metric, the standard, they've got everything. So go take a look at them. They're fabulous people, and see what they've got that you need. So back to the show. So to me, the most important things of a first flight is to make sure you got a checklist, that you're going to check everything out on your aircraft. The center of gravity's got to be right. And you need to do a warm-up flight. And what I mean by a warm-up flight is if I were to test fly this biplane here, the 68% pitch I designed, there's not a lot in this airframe that I need to be thinking about, is it going to go right? If the power plant's right, if the airframe's straight, the CG's right, the plane's going to fly. So you got to get out of your mind that the plane's just going to fall out of the sky unless you've done something wrong. Okay? Now, if you're designing an airplane totally from scratch, if you've taken your time and did your due diligence and you understand the square inches, the cubed wing loading, if you understand all the things about that airframe, you need to kind of think about it. It's going to fly just like an ARF would. If the CG's right and the throws are right, you know, it's going to fly. So you need to look at your anxieties and you need to say to yourself, am I going to be my worst nightmare? Am I going to be so anxious that I shouldn't be flying this airplane? You know, I've taught a lot of people to fly model airplanes, okay? And one of the things I say to them is you would never get drunk and drive, ride a bicycle completely trashed. You would never do that. We all know how to ride a bike, at least most of us. If we're completely coherent riding a bike, you don't even have to think about doing. When you're flying your favorite airplane, you're really not even thinking about it. You're just flying the airplane. But boy, you get into a new airplane and there's this anxiety that kind of just takes over. But a biplane like this, it's simplistic. There's not a lot that you could have screwed up. But when you look at a plane like this, a Mosquito, if you get your checklist, it's going to make sure your radio's right, your CG right, your airframe's right. But the reason I've highlighted airframe on this is this airplane has 2 motors. If it's electric, you got to make sure both the batteries are right, the ESC's right, and all that. If it's gas, it's even more critical that those engines idle right, in that you can transition them when you raise the throttles and one doesn't sputter. Because if you're on final and you decide to do a go around and you add power and one engine sputters, that twin's going to crash. So twins, if they're working perfect, you shouldn't have any anxiety. It's an airplane with wings. It's got power. Now, if you got the wing load right, planes are a pleasure to fly. But keep in mind, every time you go up in weight, you're increasing your approach speed, you're adding more power in the turns, you might be doing gentler turns because you don't want it to get into a stall in the turn. Weight is everything in model airplanes. That's one reason the cube wing loading come out, and I'll talk about that a little bit later and show you some sites that have been around for a long time for you to check your cube wing loading. The warm-up flight, I highlighted that again. I don't know how many times when I went to test fly my half-scale pits, I was nervous. But I took a Goldberg Chipmunk I had like 1,000 flights on. I took it off, did some snap rolls, flew inverted, flew a little bit of knife edge. But then what I did was I took and put the trims way off. And I took it off, and it made me fly the airplane with my sticks, not neutral. And I did that just in case I took my biplane off and it wasn't trimmed or it was doing something wonky. And I've done this on a couple of times that I test flew planes that I would actually fly my favorite airplane, but I would just cram the trims in weird places and take off and be having to fly with my sticks in very uncomfortable positions, because that can really help you when you're test flying an airplane that's not trimmed. Okay? If I were, when I went to fly my MSL2, that's what this airframe is. This is a 188-inch, 60-pound airplane, and I wasn't nervous at all when I flew this airplane because I knew it was going to fly. I checked everything. My checklist was checked. Now, since this is over 55 pounds, I had to follow the AMA over 55 pounds checklist, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. But when I went to fly this airplane, I wasn't nervous at all. When I landed it, I was ecstatic because I was kind of pushing my, how do I say this? This airplane had a lot of wing, but I didn't have a lot of power. I mean, I had enough power to fly it, but most of my giant scale airplanes fly like real aircraft. You can't just stick the nose up and fly off the prop. You have to fly off the wing. So when I landed it, I was so excited because of how well it did perform. I mean, it performed way beyond my expectations. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the checklist. So if you go to the Google, type in AMA over 55-pound model aircraft, you will find a link where you download a document, and it's actually the document made if you're going to get your plane signed off to be over 55 pounds. But in that document is a really good checklist. It's the best checklist that there's out there for model aircraft. Just take the 4 pages that make up that checklist, throw away the rest of the document, and just use that document. I like to use it for all of my flights, to be honest. But if you're doing a first flight, if you've got everything checked off in this document here I'm showing you right now, and sorry for my snuffly nose, my allergies are horrible this spring, and I hate to edit my videos. I just like to just make it very natural, like we're just having a conversation. But these checklists here are just worth their weight in gold because they just cover everything. If you've covered all of this in your aircraft, it's going to fly, and you should not be worried. One of the things about the checklist is, your linkage. I went to test fly a P-47, and it was 80-inch. And it was a guy that I knew but not very well, and he'd reached out and said, hey, would you test fly my P-47? said, sure. We went through and checked out everything. And then I told him I was going to do a servo test. He said, okay, what's that? I said, well, it's where I hold the control surface and I move your stick. And we just make sure that there's enough. So what was really bizarre on his elevator was the linkages on the bottom, the reverse of this picture. Actually, I should have flipped this picture. So when his servo pulled on the arm, it was in tension. The linkage was in tension. So when the servo pulled, he had down elevator. But when it went up elevator, it pushed. Okay? So I grabbed the elevator, pulled the stick back. I heard the servo move, but the elevator didn't move. His push rod was bowing inside the fuselage, huge. And I looked at him, I go, what kind of push rod is this? He goes, it's one that I made. And I said, it's not beefy enough. I said, look at this. And we didn't even fly the airplane that day. I convinced him to use a piece of carbon fiber tube for it instead of the very little dowel rod he had. And the crazy thing was the plans had shown the dowel rod. So it just wasn't enough, at least for what we were doing that day and the way it was rigged, okay? You also need to think about how big your flying surfaces are. This was a computer I created with an Excel spreadsheet for my giant airplanes, excuse me, to make sure my servo torque was enough to move the flying surface. If you're building a 60-inch or an 80-inch, you're probably going to be fine. If you get over 100 inches, 115, 120 inches, you probably want to start paying attention if your servos are big enough. Especially if you're getting into the 45, 50, 55-pound airplanes, you need to make sure your servos are big enough. If you're over 55, you have to prove it using this type of math to get your waiver for your over 55-pound airplane. You also need to know your radio. And I don't know how much to stress this, and I'm not talking about how it's wired in the airplane. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. I'm talking about, do you know your radio? Do you know how your radio works? Do you know which switches you've got turned on or turned off? Do you know? I don't know how to describe this, and I'm not putting anybody down, but I'm going to give you an example. I met a fella who would just arbitrarily use different buttons for different things on different airplanes he had. So his retract switch, he would use to do like the flaps on a glider. But then on his plane with a retract, he had it as a retract switch. He would just, I guess when he's setting up, say, well, this is neat. Create some commonality in the way you always set up your radio. The same switches should always be used for your exponentials, the same switch for your flaps, the same switch for your gear. Try to create so that your brain knows when you're holding the radio, if you have 10 different airplanes, all 10 of those airplanes, the retract switch would be the same switch. Okay, I know that sounds silly, that anybody would just start using arbitrary buttons, but I did that. The first time I got a radio that had more than like 4 channels, I didn't realize how many times I were setting up switches differently. And you know, you're not setting up an airplane once a week. You're setting up an airplane maybe 3 or 4 times a year or twice a year. So you kind of start forgetting how you set up that airplane. So try to create some commonality in the way that you set up your radios. Another thing, when you're going to go on your first flight, make sure all your radio equipment in there is installed right and managed. Okay, if you look inside an airplane, there's chaos and you're cramming stuff in there to get the wing on. That's not right. You can pull a servo wire, unplug it that way. You can pinch wires. I know a guy texted out one time and he was running through his sticks and I saw his nose wheel moving, but his rudder wasn't moving. I said, hey, is your rudder moving? And he goes, oh gosh, it's not. When he had crammed everything in there, he had pulled he had a Y so that one was connected to the nose gear steering, which is a servo, and the other one is connected to the rudder. Well, when he shoved it all in there, he had unplugged the Y. And then I recommended, look, you need to tape all those connections or put those little clips on there that keeps your servo wires from unplugging. If you are getting into things like S-Bus, which I use for Futaba. Make sure you got that set up right inside there. Now, your checklist will cover all of this, okay? But make sure inside that airplane, you really understand how you've programmed the servos, how everything works. If you do all of this on the front end, it's things you don't have to worry about in your test flight or your first flight. I hate to use the word test flight because if the airplane is built right, it's your maiden flight. You're not testing anything. Your maiden flight, it's a maiden flight, okay? So when we look at things like this was my MSL1 before I started covering it. This is when it still had the 3W150 in it, which I took out and put electric because it shook it too much. And if you don't know that story, I'm creating a whole video series on the MSL1. And this is my daughter sitting in it, and she's actually 20 going to college right now. But when I was getting this plane about, I don't know, 80 or 90% built, I realized that it was really coming together well, that my attachment points made sense, the plane was becoming structurally rigid. I felt good about it. If you're a scratch builder and you're not feeling good about it, stop the project and figure out why you're not feeling good, because that maiden flight should be excitement, not sheer terror. This was the MSL once it was converted to electric and it was covered and ready to go. You can see my daughter got a little bit older. But I wasn't that nervous flying this airplane. The only anxiety I had was, did I have enough watts per pound? Because there were a lot of people out there that said I didn't. And you need to make sure you don't let the boogeyman get in your head on your maiden flight or your first flight. And it's really easy if you're sharing any of your designs on YouTube or on RC groups or on Facebook, it's really easy to let the boogeyman get in your head where somebody says, you're doing that wrong. And you question yourself. A lot of times I'll look at that person and see if they've done anything like I'm doing, or they have any experience, or are they just guessing, or are they just a troll? There's always the evil forces out there that's going to try to tell you what you're doing won't work or it's stupid. And you just got to learn to ignore them. When I got the MSL2 ready for its maiden flight, I want to share something with you that I do with a lot of my airplanes. And I know there's a lot of builders that do this, but it seems like, there is no handbook on how we do this in model aviation. Okay, we're all kind of learning on our own, or we're talking to other people. Some know what they're talking about, some don't. But this is the maiden flight of the MSL. And if you notice, no wheel pants, no paint, no trim. The landing gear legs don't have any skirts on it. This plane was bare bones when I first test flew it. The reason I did it is twofold. Number one, if for some reason the plane crashed, my amount of time going into the airplane, as far as hours, had stopped at this point when I flew it. Okay, some people will get a plane so detailed and so perfect that now they're totally terrified to test fly it. When you spend 6 months putting 17,000 rivets on an airplane, you're mentally massaging that airplane that it is, you end up having such a connection to that airplane that you then all of a sudden are scared to test fly it. So you need to, I love doing it this way because it's incremental for me, okay? So, when I first had this plane done and I realized really how big it was, that was the excitement for it. I didn't need to finish it yet. I just want to make sure it flew. I want to make sure that the airframe was solid. And a lot of people call this the big banana at the beginning, and I thought that was awesome. It didn't bother me at all. And it's got that wonky, stupid windshield on it. This plane was just, at this point, proving that the airframe would fly. And I flew it for a whole season, just like this. Bare bones, no nothing on it. Fast forward 2 years, and this is what it looked like. And it's to me, it's a beautiful airplane now. And I'm not nervous at all when I fly it. But there's a part of you that you've got to say to yourself, have I mentally gone through what happens if something goes wrong? Every time I take this airplane off, unless I'm showing off, which sometimes I do, I go for altitude and I fly straight down the runway, so if I lose power, I can land straight out. If I'm kind of doing like a noon demo at like a fly-in, I'll take off and do an immediate left-hand turn right off the runway. That's dangerous. If I lose my engine, I'm going to be off the field and things are going to happen real fast. Don't do that on your first flight. Treat your first flight like everything is just going to quit in the engine. Okay, I'm not saying don't be so scared you can't fly the plane, but in your mind on that first flight, be ready for an engine failure. Okay, your radio is going to work, everything else is going to work. Just be ready for an engine failure. One of the things that's happened this last, I don't know, 10 or so years is the whole cube wing loading thing. And there's been a lot of trolls that's come out and said this is BS. But when 99% of the aviators out there like this, hey, come on. But if you don't know what cube wing loading was designed for, if I have a 100-inch wing plane that has a wing load of 35 ounces, that's a little bit high, but on a 100-inch wing, it's going to fly great. If you had a 35-ounce wing load on a 30-inch wing, there's a lot less cubic volume. The molecules are being interacted completely different. That 30-inch airplane with a 35-ounce wing load would be almost unflyable. So some people got together and they wanted to build just a general kind of math to say, if you've got this size wing, you got this cube wing loading, and your airplane would fall into one of these categories here. So if you've got a 40-inch or a 30-inch wing airplane that has a cube wing loading of 5 to 7, it's going to fly like a trainer. Okay, that's the cool thing about cube wing loading is if you scratch build an airplane that's 30-inch wing, you take the square inches and how many ounces the plane weighs, and it will give you a cube wing loading. If you see that it's 13 and over, holy cow, you've built a small airplane that has a high wing load. It's probably going to fly like crap. Okay, now if you don't know how to do any of this, just type in cube wing loading on the internet. There's all these calculators out there that you put in your math, and it just tells you right there what your cube wing loading is going to be. So on that first flight, you want your anxieties to be very calm. You want them to be you want to enjoy flying the airplane. If you know you got a cube wing loading of 13, you know in your mind, okay, this thing's going to be a lead sled, and I've got to fly it like a lead sled. If I got a cube wing loading of 5, the plane's going to be a floater. So forget about how big or small your airplane is. Okay, that's the beauty of cube wing loading. If it's a 30-inch wing, it's got a cube wing loading of 5, it's going to fly beautiful. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get through to everybody is on that first flight, if you've done all your due diligence and you understand everything about that airplane, just fly it, have fun. And then the don'ts. So don't freak out. Okay, I have seen a lot of people test fly airplanes where they just quit flying the airplane and let it crash because they just said it was out of control. Normally when a plane is out of control, rarely is it the CG. Okay, you should know when you've put the plane, however you check your CG, you should know, and I did a whole video on this about, no dummy, it's not your CG. So go find that video. I don't know how many people have taken an airplane off and started screaming, my CG's off. And it's not. Their throws are too far and their trims are off. Or their incidence is off if they scratch build the airplane. So don't freak out. Don't panic. And don't just send it. I've watched people taxi out an airplane and say, oh, this is my first flight. They just fire a wallet and they take off. 90% of the time they're fine. 10% of the time it's a handful, and maybe 2 or 3% of the time they actually crash the airplane. All I'm trying to do with this video is share how I've done this and give you some recommendations that might work for you. Your mileage may differ. You may have all kinds of ideas on how you made in a plane, and that's awesome. I'm not saying my way is the only way. I'm just trying to get people to relax That maiden flight, you need to be the best of the best at that moment. And having your anxieties all ramped up and being scared to death of the airplane. Now look, if you're a scratch builder and you're experimenting with things, you got to own up to that. You got to say, now I am a test pilot. Okay, I've built my own airplane. I built my own airframe. I've designed my own airframe. I've decided how big the ailerons are going to be, the elevators, the rudders. I decided how long the fuselage is. I've done all of this. So if you're scared of test flying it, that's on you, because you should not be building experimental airframes and not know that, yes, there's going to be times it doesn't work. There's going to be times it crashes. That's just part of it if you're designing from scratch. But if you're building a kit or building from plans, make sure you follow everything that's in the directions or instructions or on the drawings, and just have fun flying. So that's it, everybody. I don't want to get too talkative, because you know, I have people saying, oh, I want your videos to be longer. And then I got other people saying, oh, you could have done this video in 5 minutes. I can't make everybody happy. But what I want you to do is be a happy flying model aircraft. And I want you to have your best chances for having successful flights. And sorry I'm losing my voice. My allergies are horrible this year. And who would have thought that I'd have allergies? So everybody have an awesome day. Rock on. Take a kid flying. You know how I feel about this if you've been watching my videos. Stick them in front of a TV where they drive Corvettes around and drive over people's bodies, or they climb up in a skyscraper and they start sniping all these people. That's not the best way to become an engineer or learn physics or learn engineering or any of that stuff. Aviation and model aviation generally really helps people learn how to be engineers and learn how to build things with their hands and do things. You know, spending 8 hours on a video game could build a lot of airplanes in 8 hours. So rock on, everybody. See you next time, and be safe. Bye-bye.